Anyone who loves to fish knows that this is one activity that requires patience. A lot of it. So when Dennis, an avid fisherman, didn't catch anything the whole day, he wasn't really too disappointed. It was a slow day, you win some and lose some. At least it was great, quiet afternoon spent outdoors. But suddenly, his fishing rod started to pull, and it was tugging especially hard at the line. He had been fishing in these waters for years, but hadn't quite experienced anything like it. Dennis realized what he had caught. He knew he should have left it alone. Dennis and his fellow fishermen looked at their catch in complete disbelief. Neither of them had ever seen anything like this before. Dennis wasn't quite sure what they had caught and contemplated tossing it back into the water. But curiosity got the best of Dennis and his fishing partner. They wanted a closer look. As they inched closer to their curious catch, it started acting aggressively. Before we start, can we get this video to 1,000 likes? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Dennis got nervous. He wanted to throw it back into the water, but just as he was about to throw it, he noticed something. Something that could explain what this bizarre creature was. Brought to tears when Dennis was sure about what he saw, tears began to well up in his eyes. He immediately called the police. Everybody had to know. Dennis has been fishing with his granddad since he only was 5 years old. He has been a fishing enthusiast ever since. At this point, he believed he had caught everything the seas had to offer. But this one catch would turn his whole world upside down. What was so surprising was that he caught the monster at his favorite fishing spot. Dennis and his granddad have caught thousands of fish here, but they'd never caught anything like this. Dennis got a message in his inbox from someone who had only joined the forum 2 weeks ago. He would have liked to find somebody with more experience, but nobody else paid any attention to his message. And Dennis really didn't want to be alone today. So while he was apprehensive about bringing a rookie along for this trip, he knew he would have to do. Dennis would pick up the rookie in a bar the next town over, and then they would drive to one of his favorite spots. In remembrance of his granddad, Dennis wanted to go to their favorite spot. After an hour of driving, Dennis finally arrived at the bar. He walked inside and instantly felt very uncomfortable. He saw a casually dressed middle-aged man with a beard. "Hey, I've been looking for you. I am Drake. I spoke to you on the forum." Dennis got a weird feeling about this guy. It all sounded like an odd lie, and besides, Drake doesn't even look like a fisher. After getting to know each other better, Drake told Dennis that he didn't have much fishing experience, but he felt like this was his passion. Dennis told him he would teach him a thing or two. Dennis still didn't completely trust Drake, but maybe he wasn't so bad after all. Out on the water, Dennis was ready to show that he didn't need any advice from anyone. He wanted to show off who was the real fishing expert among them. But this did not go to plan at all. Dennis was embarrassing himself and his granddad with what he did next. While Drake was reeling in fish after fish, Dennis could not even get a guppy on the boat. How is this possible? Drake really needed to pee, but as they were on a small wooden fisherman's boat, there was no toilet. He had no choice but to pee off the other side of the ship, so he did. While Drake was peeing, Dennis quickly went through his fishing gear. Surprisingly, most of it seemed familiar to him. But this one particular thing really stood out. Drake had a few really odd-looking lures Dennis had never seen before. Could this be what gave him all the success? But then he heard Drake coming back from the front of the boat. Without looking, Dennis quickly grabbed one of those unique lures. As Drake was pulling in another catch just minutes later, Dennis quickly changed his lure to the one he stole from Drake. While Dennis was putting it on, he took a closer look at it. It looked so weird. He could not imagine getting even one fish with this. Dennis didn't know a few minutes away from the greatest catch ever. It only took a few minutes before something started pulling on Dennis's line. And it started pulling hard. This was bigger, heavier, and stronger than anything he had caught before. Dennis began to think this could be the biggest monster he had ever caught. And it was right. Dennis's hands and arms were sore from fighting the fish. Dennis started wondering what he could have possibly hooked that would put up such a fight. Dennis didn't want to admit it, but to get the fish out of the water, he needed Drake's help to steer the boat in the right direction. Drake didn't hesitate a second and jumped to the steering wheel. They were working together like they had been a duo for years. After battling the monster for half an hour, They finally caught a glimpse of the horrifying creature. Drake got the shock of his life and let go of the rod. Drake quickly ran back to the steering wheel and sailed away. Minutes later, he realized Dennis wasn't on the boat anymore. He must have fallen off the boat when Drake let go of the rod. Drake quickly turned the boat around in the hope of finding his friend. Drake sailed back to where they were before, but there was no sign of Dennis. Drake started stressing out. What if the monster has gotten him? He needed to find Dennis as soon as possible. Just when he was about to give up all hope, he saw something floating in the distance. It was Dennis. Drake quickly sailed towards him and pulled Dennis out of the water. Dennis was pissed and yelled, "How could you ever leave me alone?" He still wanted to chase the monster. They're way too invested to just let it go now. "It's your fault we lost the monster, and besides that, you almost got me killed," Dennis yelled at Drake. "I should have never taken a rookie with me. I knew you weren't ready for this." After a few minutes of searching, they found his rod floating in the sea. They caught the rod and managed to get it out of the water. The line started racing again as soon as they got a hold of it. The monster was still hooked. This time, they both committed to reeling it in, and they succeeded. After an hour-long battle, they got the monster to the surface. This time, they worked together like the power duo they were meant to be. Dennis had to know what kind of creature this was. But when they tried to inspect the animal, it started acting aggressively. Then, all of a sudden, it bit Dennis, and it bit hard. Out of shock, he threw it back into the water, but it wasn't hooked anymore this time. Dennis' arms started to swell up, and it even turned purple after a minute. Dennis fell to the ground. Drake immediately called the Coast Guard. After 30 long minutes, the Coast Guards arrived. Dennis has already turned completely pale. They told Drake that they won't get back in time if they travel by boat. That's why an emergency helicopter is already on its way to get them to the hospital. Dennis woke up in the hospital and saw a policeman standing beside him. He looks at his arm, and surprisingly, everything is okay. What happened? He told the officer that Dennis and Drake had found a very rare fish species, and because there is no anti-venom for his bite, this is one of the most venomous fish on the record. But if there is no anti-venom, how did Dennis survive? The officer told him that he had gotten a blood transfusion from his friend. That blood transfusion saved his life. Dennis asked where Drake was, but the officer said there was no Drake, not even in the helicopter. The officer explained to Dennis why he was there. Dennis had made the discovery of the century. This fish has rarely ever been seen, and there are no survivors of its bite on the record. The media is waiting outside for an interview. The officer is with him for an escort. Dennis wanted to get ready to go outside and asked if the officer would leave the room for some privacy. So Dennis got changed, and just as we were about to leave, he noticed a letter underneath the chair's pillow. Dennis opens the letter, and Drake explains everything in the letter. His actual name is James. He told Dennis that he was his long-lost brother and had been searching for him for years. When James moved to this town, he already gave up hope, but then he saw his ad on a Fisher forum. James and Dennis were separated when their parents got divorced. Dennis was only 2 years old when they did, so he didn't remember anything from that time. Dennis got sent to his granddad, and James stayed with their birth mother. Their father wasn't in the picture anymore. Ever since James has been looking for Dennis, he always felt like Dennis was near. When James finally found Dennis, he felt like he wasn't good enough for his little brother, so he left town as soon as possible. While their first meeting wasn't exactly smooth, he was grateful to have family through this traumatizing experience, and he hoped they would meet again one day soon.